They thought they could break her with a slap. They thought she would shrink, bow her head, and accept their authority like countless others before her. But in that split second, when the sting burned across her cheek, what they awakened was not fear, it was history, dignity, and justice wrapped into one woman's silence. The night was humid, the kind of sticky southern night where even the street lamps seemed tired of burning. Judge Mariah Collins had left her office late, her robe folded carefully in her leather briefcase, her hair pulled into a neat bun that had loosened over the course of the day. She was not dressed like a judge. She was dressed like any other black woman who worked too long and carried her life in silence. A navy blazer, worn flats, a pair of silver earrings that once belonged to her grandmother. The badge of her power, the authority of the United States federal court, lay invisible, tucked away in papers no one on that street corner could see. The flashing red and blue lights erupted behind her car just as she crossed Maple and 3rd. She sighed, pulled over, hands steady on the wheel. She knew this ritual. Black parents called it the talk, but for her, it had been lived more times than she could count. Keep your hands visible, speak calmly, do not challenge. Yet even as she rehearsed these rules, she knew they were not rules for survival, they were prayers, whispered into a system deaf to the people it devoured. 2 officers approached. Their boots struck the pavement with the rhythm of ownership. One, tall and pale, smirked as he tapped her rear window with his flashlight. The other circled to her passenger side, hand already resting on his holster. They didn't ask for her license first. They asked her where she was going, why she was out so late, who the car belonged to. Each question was a brick laid in the wall they were building to trap her. She answered with the patience of a saint, though her jaw tightened. Then came the order, step out of the vehicle. Mariah obeyed. Her heels clicked softly on the asphalt, her blazer catching in the night air. One officer leaned in too close, his breath sour with coffee and authority. You people always think you belong in places you don't, he muttered, as if it were a secret meant only for her skin to hear. She looked him dead in the eye, and for the first time that night, she felt her robe, though not on her shoulders, wrap around her like armor. The search was unnecessary, invasive. They rifled through her purse, scattering receipts and a small notebook filled with court notes. They touched her hair, laughed when she stiffened. She said nothing. She had learned silence could be a weapon sharper than protest. But when she reached to pick up her grandmother's earrings from the pavement, one officer shoved her back and, with a swift motion, slapped her across the face. The sound cracked louder than the cicadas in the trees. Her head turned with the blow, her cheek ablaze, but her eyes remained fixed, steady, unbroken. And in that silence, in the seconds where their laughter filled the air, she knew something deeper than rage. She knew destiny. These men were not just officers. They were defendants. Their names had crossed her docket in corruption cases, in misconduct complaints, in whispers from young lawyers who spoke of justice never served. And tomorrow, when she entered her courtroom, she would not need to shout. She would not need to strike back. The law, heavy and relentless, would speak for her. But tonight was not yet tomorrow. Tonight, she was still just a woman with a stinging cheek and a choice: to remain silent or to let her silence sharpen into the kind of blade that could carve justice out of stone. She straightened her blazer, met their sneers with a calm so unnerving it silenced even their arrogance. "Are you finished?" she asked softly. They laughed again. "We'll decide when we're finished," one said, shoving her toward her car. Her hand touched the door handle, but her eyes lifted to the golden streetlight above them. It burned steady, unyielding, illuminating her face like a spotlight. In that glow, she whispered not to them, but to herself, to her grandmother, to every black woman who had ever walked this road before her. Tomorrow, she would not need to prove her worth with compliance. Tomorrow, they would learn the weight of her silence, the fire behind her restraint. And tomorrow, when their names echoed in her courtroom, when they looked up from the defense table and saw her seated in judgment, the slap they had delivered would become their undoing. For now, the night closed in around her. But the night, no matter how dark, was never stronger than the dawn. The slap lingered on her cheek like an unwanted signature, but it was not shame that stayed with her as she drove home under the shadow of the flashing lights. It was resolve. Every mile of cracked asphalt beneath her tires whispered reminders of how often her people had been struck, silenced, mocked, discarded. Yet tonight, the sting was not hers alone to carry. Tonight it was evidence. Tonight it was prophecy. When she reached her townhouse, the air was still heavy with the heat of the day, pressing down on her shoulders. She walked inside without turning on the lights. Darkness was easier than reflection, and besides, she needed silence more than illumination. She stood in the hallway, fingers pressed against the wall, listening to her own breath. It was slow, measured, controlled, exactly as she had trained herself to be. On the table by the door lay the files she had brought home. Cases stacked high, briefs annotated with her neat script, yellow sticky notes marking the edges like a field of flags. At the top of the pile sat a folder labeled in bold black type, Collins versus State Police Department disciplinary hearings pending. Her lips curved into something between a grimace and a smile. Fate, it seemed, did not know subtlety. The names inside that folder belonged to the very men who had pulled her over hours before. Officer Daniel Kruger, Officer Mark Riley, men who had accumulated complaints as though they were badges of honor. Excessive force, intimidation, evidence tampering. None had yet stuck, because the system bent and twisted itself to protect them. But tomorrow, for the first time, they would sit across from her in the courtroom. And tomorrow, they would no longer see a tired black woman on the side of the road. They would see Judge Mariah Collins, robed and unflinching. Still, even as the truth burned in her chest, doubt crept at the edges. What if they retaliated? What if word spread that she had been involved in an altercation before presiding over their case? The system was fickle. A single accusation of bias could undo months, years of work. She sat at her kitchen table, resting her head in her hands, the quiet hum of the refrigerator the only witness to her turmoil. She remembered her grandmother's voice then, soft but firm, telling her as a child that power doesn't come from shouting, baby. It comes from knowing when to speak and when to let the silence choke them. Her grandmother, who had marched in Selma, who had been shoved and spit on, who had stood on courthouse steps demanding rights that Mariah now embodied. That memory steadied her. She rose, placed the file neatly back in order, and whispered again, tomorrow. Morning came without apology. The sun rose hot and golden, streaming through her curtains with an insistence that refused to let the night's weight linger. Mariah dressed slowly, deliberately. The robe came last, heavy on her shoulders, a garment both sacred and burdensome. When she caught her reflection in the mirror, she did not see the slap's red imprint anymore. She saw steel. Courtroom 4B was crowded by the time she entered. Lawyers shuffled papers, reporters lingered in the back rows, and a hush fell as the bailiff called the session to order. The gavel in her hand felt colder than usual, as though it too sensed the gravity of the day. She surveyed the room, her gaze steady, her expression neutral. She would not betray the storm within. And then she saw them. Officers Kruger and Riley, seated at the defense table, their uniforms pressed, their faces arranged into masks of confidence. But beneath that polish, she saw a twitch in Kruger's jaw, the restless tapping of Riley's fingers. They did not yet recognize her. Not here, not in this setting. To them, she was only the judge, not the woman they had humiliated, not the cheek they had branded with their arrogance. The first motions were procedural. Lawyers argued, objections rose and fell like waves, and Mariah steered the proceedings with calm precision. But inside, her pulse was a drumbeat. Each time their names were spoken aloud, it was as though the night before replayed in fragments. The flashlight tapping her window, the hands rifling through her purse, the sting of that slap. She anchored herself in the present, in the law, in the robe that shielded her from vengeance even as it armed her with authority. Hours passed. Witnesses took the stand, recounting patterns of misconduct, describing nights that sounded too familiar to Mariah's own. A young man with a scar above his eyebrow spoke of being pulled from his car without cause. A woman trembled as she recalled being threatened into silence after reporting harassment. Each story stacked upon the last, a tower of injustice that teetered toward collapse. And still, the officers sat smugly, whispering to their attorney, exchanging glances that reeked of entitlement. They believed the system would bend once again. They believed no black woman, judge or otherwise, could undo the shield of their badge. It was during cross-examination that their arrogance cracked. A defense attorney, in an attempt to discredit a witness, asked about bias against law enforcement. The witness hesitated, eyes flickering to Mariah as if seeking permission. Mariah nodded subtly, granting the courage that the woman's trembling voice needed. "I'm not biased," the woman said, her voice steadying. "I'm terrified, because men like them think they can do anything and get away with it. And too often they do." A ripple moved through the courtroom. The reporters scribbled faster. The jury leaned forward, and for the first time, Kruger shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Riley's jaw tightened. The mask was slipping. Mariah felt the shift like a current. This was no longer just testimony. This was truth breaking through the cracks of the system. And she knew then that the slap had not been a mark of humiliation, it had been a spark. By late afternoon, the heat outside had grown oppressive, pressing against the courthouse walls. Inside, tension hung heavy. Closing arguments loomed, and Mariah's mind flickered to what lay beyond this trial. Retribution was dangerous. Retaliation was real. But so was the weight of her oath. Justice without fear or favor. When the lawyers rested their cases, the courtroom grew still. The jurors would deliberate, but Mariah knew her role was not yet finished. Before adjourning, she addressed the court. Her voice carried across the room, even, measured, yet infused with something no gavel could command. "This court is not blind to the patterns presented here," she began. "It is not deaf to the voices that have long been silenced. The law demands fairness, but fairness is not the same as forgetting. Accountability is not vengeance, it is justice. And justice cannot be delayed without being denied." Her words settled into the room like stones dropped into still water, rippling outward. She saw Kruger glance at Riley, confusion dawning. For a moment, she felt it again, that spotlight of destiny, that reminder that no darkness lasted forever. She stepped into the hallway, the sound of her heels echoing, and whispered again, just for herself, "Tomorrow." The night after the first day of trial, Mariah did not sleep. The courthouse silence still echoed in her ears, the murmurs of the gallery replaying like a haunting chorus. She lay awake staring at the ceiling, the golden streetlight outside her window cutting long shadows across her room. It reminded her of the moment she had stood under the same glow when those officers struck her. But tonight, the glow no longer felt like a witness to her humiliation, it felt like a guardian, a reminder that the truth had already begun to carve its way into the world. She rose before dawn. Coffee brewed in the kitchen, bitter and strong, filling her home with the scent of alertness. She sipped it slowly, eyes on the folder she had placed deliberately in the center of her table. Inside it were their names, their records, their legacies of misconduct. But what lay beneath those pages was heavier still, the memory of her grandmother's earrings glinting on the pavement, scattered by careless hands. That was not something any verdict could erase. By the time she reached the courthouse, the city was stirring. Reporters clustered outside, cameras poised like vultures on telephone wires. Their voices called her name, questions hurled like stones. "Judge Collins, do you believe the jury will convict? Do you think this case will set precedent?" She said nothing. She walked past them, her robe draped over her arm, her face unreadable. Silence was her shield. Inside, the jurors were already sequestered, deliberating behind closed doors. The weight of their task pressed down on the entire building. Lawyers paced the corridors, their eyes flickering with nervous energy. The officers, however, remained confident, or at least performed confidence. Kruger lounged in his chair with forced ease. Riley cracked jokes too loudly, and their attorney whispered strategy with the calm arrogance of a man who had navigated this system long enough to trust its protection. But Mariah saw the fractures. Every so often, Kruger's eyes darted toward her, as if trying to place her. Recognition tugged at the edge of his memory, like a shadow he couldn't chase. Riley's smile faltered whenever silence fell too heavily, whenever the echo of testimony seemed to linger longer than it should. They were beginning to feel the walls of the courtroom closing in. As the hours dragged, Mariah slipped into chambers, where her clerk, a young black woman named Jasmine, waited with a stack of briefs. Jasmine had always been efficient, steady, and professional, but today her eyes carried a quiet fire. She hesitated before speaking. "Judge Collins, may I say something off record?" Mariah looked up, surprised by the tremor in her voice. "Go ahead." Jasmine's hands clenched around the files. I heard what those witnesses said yesterday. I saw their fear. And I need you to know that people like me weary watching. We're hoping. You may not say much in there, but it matters. Every word, every silent sight matters. Mariah studied her. Jasmine was younger, unscarred by the weight of decades, yet already carrying the burden of being a black woman in halls of power that weren't built for her. For a moment, Mariah saw herself at that age, fresh out of law school, still believing justice was a clean word rather than a bloody fight. She nodded slowly. Thank you, Jasmine. But remember, this robe doesn't belong to me. It belongs to the law. And the law belongs to the people. That's all we can hold to. But even as she spoke the words, she felt the irony twist inside her. The law was supposed to belong to the people. Yet last night it had belonged to two officers who believed their badge placed them above consequence. And if she had not been a judge, if she had only been Mariah Collins, woman, black, alone on the road, who would have carried her story into this room? By evening, the jury had not yet reached a verdict. They requested transcripts, evidence reviews, deliberated past sundown. The officers began to sweat. Their attorney masked his unease with chatter, but the tightness around his mouth betrayed him. The gallery buzzed with restless anticipation, reporters scribbling predictions that would fill headlines by morning. Mariah adjourned the court for the night, her gavel striking heavy against the wood. As the room emptied, she lingered on the bench, staring at the empty seats where jurors had sat. She thought of their faces, ordinary citizens tasked with extraordinary responsibility. Would they see past the badges, past the excuses, past the endless weight of precedent? Or would they fold, like so many before them? The next morning, the courthouse was electric. Word spread quickly. The jury had reached a decision. By 9 a.m., the gallery overflowed. People pressed shoulder to shoulder, the air thick with heat and expectation. Reporters jostled for position, cameras flashing. The officers entered with forced composure, their uniforms crisp, but their eyes betraying sleepless nights. Mariah entered last, robe flowing, face calm. She took her seat, the gavel striking once more. The bailiff's voice boomed, "All rise for the jury." The jurors filed in, expressions unreadable. A silence fell so deep it seemed the building itself held its breath. The foreman stood, a folded piece of paper trembling slightly in his hand. He cleared his throat, voice steady. In the case of misconduct, abuse of power, and civil rights violations against officers Daniel Kruger and Mark Riley, we, the jury, find the defendants. The pause stretched, a thin line pulled taut across the room. Mariah's heart beat once, twice, before the word dropped like a stone into water. Guilty. Gasps erupted in the gallery. Some wept openly. Others clapped before being silenced by the bailiff's gavel. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment, pins racing, cameras flashing. Kruger's jaw fell open, disbelief etched across his face. Riley muttered a curse under his breath, his composure unraveling. Their attorney slammed a fist against the table, already preparing for appeal. But Mariah did not move. Her expression remained steady, her hands folded. Inside, though, she felt the air shift, the centuries of silence cracking, the echo of her grandmother's voice whispering that justice, when it comes, is never too late. The sentencing would come later, after appeals and motions and the grinding machinery of the system. But today, the verdict itself was a victory. Today, the law had spoken in a voice louder than the slap on her cheek. As she read the formal statement, her eyes lifted, meeting Kruger's for the first time in recognition. His eyes widened, a flicker of realization sparking. The memory of the night, the woman on the roadside, the slap suddenly colliding with the judge on the bench. Color drained from his face. Riley followed his gaze, confusion turning to shock, and then to horror. Mariah held their gaze just long enough to let the truth settle in. The woman they thought powerless, the woman they tried to break, was the one who now held their fate. She said nothing, because silence was enough. When she struck the gavel one final time, the sound reverberated through the chamber like thunder. The court stood dismissed, but no one forgot the weight of that moment. As the gallery emptied, Jasmine approached, her eyes bright with unspoken pride. "Judge Collins," she whispered, "you didn't have to say a word. They saw it. Everyone saw it." Mariah allowed herself the smallest of smiles. Not triumph, not vengeance, but something quieter. Something closer to peace. Good, she murmured. Then maybe tomorrow will be different. She walked out of the courtroom, the golden light pouring through the tall windows once again, bathing her in a glow that felt less like burden and more like blessing. The slap had not silenced her. It had awakened the law, and in that awakening, justice had found its voice. The courthouse emptied, but the echoes of the verdict refused to fade. By the time Mariah reached her chambers, the weight of what had just unfolded pressed down on her chest. She loosened her robe, folded it neatly over the back of her chair, and sat for a long moment in silence. Outside her window, the city pulsed with life, unaware or perhaps unwilling to fully understand that something had shifted inside these walls. For years she had sat on this bench, listening to the same patterns play out. Complaints dismissed, officers shielded, victims silenced by fear or exhaustion. The system always found a way to protect its own. But today was different. Today, the law had cracked open, if only slightly, and let the light pour through. Jasmine entered quietly, carrying a stack of press clippings already circulating online. Headlines screamed from the pages. Historic verdict in police misconduct trial. Officers convicted in landmark case. Judge Collins oversees shocking decision. Mariah skimmed them, her eyes catching on her own name. It was strange discomforting, to see herself so entangled in the story. She had sworn never to make herself the center of any trial, never to let ego distort her duty. But she knew this was larger than her. She was not the story. The story was the verdict. The story was the woman who had found her grandmother's earrings scattered on the pavement and lived to bring the men responsible to justice. They'll appeal, Jasmine said softly. You know they will. Mariah nodded. Of course. That's their right. But appeals won't erase today. Appeals can't erase recognition. For the first time since the trial began, Jasmine allowed herself a smile. You scared them, she said. Not because of the robe, but because of who you are. Because you were the woman on that street. And now they know it. Mariah met her gaze, steady. They'll never admit it out loud. But that's not what matters. What matters is the truth is no longer hidden. The following days unfolded in a blur of headlines and interviews she refused to give. Reporters camped outside her home. Anchors spoke her name on nightly broadcasts. Activists held rallies in the streets. For the community, the verdict was more than just a sight, was a symbol, proof that the system could bend differently, even if only for a moment. For others, it was a threat, a sign that accountability was creeping too close to power. She received letters, hundreds of them. Some handwritten, trembling on lined paper, from mothers who had buried sons. Some typed neatly on legal letterhead, from organizations long fighting in the trenches. Others came laced with venom, anonymous notes calling her biased, unfit, dangerous. She read them all. She saved the ones that carried hope. At night, she still remembered the slap. The sting had long faded, but its echo remained. Yet now, instead of humiliation, she felt something else. The slap was no longer theirs to define. It was hers. It was a mark that reminded her she had stood, endured, and prevailed. It had not broken her. It had revealed her strength. One evening, as the sun set in streaks of gold across the city, she walked to her grandmother's grave. The cemetery was quiet, the air heavy with the scent of magnolias. She knelt, placing the silver earrings now repaired in the stone. Her voice was low, almost a whisper. They tried to take these from me, Nana. They tried to take my dignity, too. But I remembered what you taught me. Power isn't in the shouting. It's in the silence that makes them tremble. And yesterday, I made them tremble. The wind rustled the leaves, carrying with it the faintest warmth, as if the past itself leaned close to listen. Weeks passed. The officers awaited sentencing, their uniforms stripped, their reputations shattered. Appeals were filed, motions contested, but the verdict held like bedrock. In the city, conversations shifted. Police reform bills gained traction. Community meetings swelled with new voices demanding change. For the first time in years, people believed accountability was possible. Yet Mariah knew better than to romanticize. One verdict did not dismantle centuries. One trial did not heal wounds carved deep into the nation's soul. She carried no illusions that racism would vanish because a jury spoke truth. But she also carried something new, hope that small cracks could widen, that golden light could slip through even the smallest fracture. One afternoon, She returned to the very street where it had begun. Maple and 3rd, the place where flashing lights had pulled her from anonymity and tried to pin her down. She parked her car deliberately, stepping out onto the cracked pavement. The sun was bright, warm, bathing the corner in a golden glow that made the asphalt shimmer. She stood there for a long time, watching traffic flow, hearing the distant laughter of children from a nearby park. The memory of boots on pavement, of hands in her hair, of that slap across her facade, all returned. But instead of pain, she felt resolve. A man approached, older, with tired eyes and a worn cap. He paused when he saw her. "You're her, aren't you?" he asked softly. Mariah tilted her head. "Her. The judge," he said. "The one who put them away. I seen you on the news." She nodded slowly. The man's voice trembled. "Thank you, my boy. He didn't make it home one night. Same uniforms, different faces. Nobody listened then. But they listened to you." Mariah felt her throat tighten. She reached out, placing a hand gently on his shoulder. "I listened," she said, "and I'll keep listening." His eyes filled with tears, but he nodded, gripping her hand with gratitude that words could not carry. When she left that corner, she no longer felt haunted. She felt claimed, not by trauma, but by purpose. Months later, on the day of sentencing, the courtroom was once again filled to the brim. The officers stood before her, no longer in uniform, their arrogance stripped away. Kruger's face was pale, Riley's eyes darted like a trapped animal. Their attorney spoke of their years of service, their families, their reputations. He begged for leniency. Mariah listened, expression unreadable. When it was her turn to speak, she rose slowly, the robe draped around her like history itself. Her voice was calm, steady, carrying the weight of every story that had filled her courtroom. "You wore the badge of law, and with it, the trust of this community. That trust was not a shield for your abuse. It was a responsibility, and you betrayed it. Justice today is not revenge. It is accountability, and accountability is the beginning of trust restored." Fear of the woman they could not break. When the gavel struck one final time, Mariah exhaled slowly. The case was over. The courtroom emptied. But the story would live on, carried in whispers, in headlines, in the steady march of people demanding more. She returned to her chambers, closing the door behind her. The golden light of the late afternoon spilled across her desk, warming the pages of new cases already waiting. She sat, hands folded, eyes steady. Tomorrow, there would be more work, more injustice, more battles. But tonight, she allowed herself one quiet truth. She had endured. She had held her silence until it thundered. And in doing so, she had reminded the world that justice, though slow, though fragile, could still rise like the sun. As the city outside settled into evening, Mariah whispered once more, the same word that had carried her from the slap to the verdict, from the street to the bench, from silence to voice. Tomorrow, and tomorrow, she knew, the light would come again. Thank you for listening. If you find it interesting, please like and subscribe to follow the next stories.